To change the world for the better, we must change how we do business, starting with where and how we invest our money. That's the rallying cry of my guest today, Sir Ronald Cohen. Sir Ronald, or Ronnie, as he prefers to be known from time to time, took the lessons he had learned from being one of the UK's most successful investors and has spent the last 20 years relentlessly driving the development of what is now known as impact investments. He's the chairman of the Global Steering Group for Impact Investment and the Portland Trust, and has recently brought out his second book called Impact: Reshaping Capitalism to Drive Real Change. So Ronald Cohen, Ronnie, a warm welcome to the Positive Leadership Podcast. Thank you so much.
Great pleasure to be here with you, Jean-Philippe.
You know, Ronnie, you've had the most incredible journey, from a refugee to a super successful venture capitalist to impact investing pioneer. What really stands out for me is your lifelong interest in helping others. It's something I'd like to explore in this conversation together. But first, I'd like to go right back to the beginning. You were born in 1945 in Cairo, in Egypt, to a Jewish family.
Yep.
So what do you remember about your time in Egypt, if you do, and what has shaped you from that time in your life?
What I remember was a society where Muslims, Christians and Jews got on extremely well. Religion was not an issue. When I asked my dad, I must have been 7 or 8 years old, what is religion about? He said to me, religions are just the different sides of a pyramid leading to the same God. and that's what I left Egypt feeling about my childhood. Now, obviously, we lost everything. We had to leave precipitously with a suitcase each and 10 Egyptian pounds. So it was a very traumatic experience for my parents. But this feeling that we can all get on, and that at the end of the day we're all seeking to lead normal lives, is what has motivated me to get so involved in trying to help resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Jean-Philippe.
And so you just talked about the tragic events of the time. I think it was in 1957, right, when President Gamal Abdel Nasser drove out Egypt's Jewish population in the aftermath of the Suez Crisis. This is when I think you had to go. And actually it reminds me of my own family history in different contexts, Ronnie. My parents, my 2 sisters, my grandma, myself had to leave Algeria when the country became independent in 1962. So when I was 18 months old, I was younger than yourself, but it was a complete reset for my family. So I can fully relate to what you mean. Coming back to France, in the case you could say it was the same country, but it looked like almost like a different country for us. And we had to start again from scratch with a couple of bits of luggage, but the incredible fighting spirit. And I think this is what you did. So how did you react, as a person, as a child, to this dramatic change in your circumstances? In my previous podcast, I had Bill George, who would call that a crucible moment. So what was that, a crucible moment for you, Ronnie? And what did you learn from it again?
So interesting that we should share similar backgrounds as refugees, Jean-Philippe. In the case of my parents, who were in their mid-40s, they presented everything as a challenge to me. So the biggest impression that was made on me at the time of my arrival in the UK is when my dad took me to visit the headmaster of a state school, and he had to gain admittance for me. And he said to the headmaster, look, it's not because he's my kid, but if you take him, he'll be top of the class. Now, you can imagine for an 11-year-old shifting country in rented accommodation in a small apartment, trying to get into a school, the sense of responsibility that, that it gave me to perform. And small things like my mother baking a chocolate cake the minute we arrived in our small apartment to make life seem completely normal. Those things led me to have a very positive attitude about the challenge of learning English. I didn't speak English at the time, adjusting to life in Britain, and in retrospect, I was extremely lucky in my life to be welcomed by the UK and to build my life there.
So you really took every opportunity or every challenge, I would say, Ronnie, as an opportunity to grow and learn and do more for developing yourself, but also supporting, I guess, your family, parents, and others in this new context for the entire family, which I think is
yeah. No, I was aware from about the age of 16 onwards that I would have to look after my parents. That I would have to sustain them financially in their later years, and so I knew that I had to be financially successful to be able to do that, and I suppose as time went on, and I went to Oxford, which I did thanks to an unbelievable teacher that I found in this state school, Richard Farley, to whom I owe a huge amount, and whom incidentally I tracked down 40 years after leaving Orange Hill Grammar School and spent a few years chatting with him. Going to Oxford was a huge thing for me. You can imagine coming as a refugee 7 years earlier, and then all of a sudden I'm in this 14th century quadrangle at Exeter College with the huge privilege of having tutorials with famous professors and and so on and so forth. And Oxford in the 60s was a very idealistic time, not unlike the period that millennials represent today. This was the period of anti-nuclear armaments. This was flower power. And so the combination of these values and the necessity for me to become financially independent, to support my parents, eventually led me to this notion of doing good and doing well, which I tried to do through venture capital.
We'll come back to that, Ronnie. That's wonderful to hear about the way, again, that crucible moment started to define who you are and what you gonna achieve in your life. And one of the things that I think is important for a positive leader to be able to do, and I was talking about this on the podcast with a guest called Mo Godat, who is the best-selling author of Solve for Happy, is to be able to define your ambition when managing your own expectations in life. So it's both being ambitious, but having clear expectations for your life. And to be bold in that ambition. I think you are very bold in your ambitions, fairly early on. Back in 1972, you just briefly talk about that. I think when you were 26 years old, you decided to create one of the very first venture funds in the UK, Apex Partners. Apex went on to become one of Europe's and global leading private equity firms, providing seed funding to companies including Apple, Waterstones, Virgin, AOL, and many more, I think. So what was your ambition, your bold goal at the time, Ronnie, when you set up Apex? And why were you so certain that creating this new form of finance could work?
I felt that the sky was the limit, Jean-Philippe. I was lucky when I was at Oxford to be elected president of the Oxford Union, which is the debating society, which has been a sort of school for prime ministers in the UK. And when I was president of the union, I invited very prominent people to come and speak during my term of office. So there are 3 presidents of the union a year. You get elected based on your debating powers. And I invited Bobby Kennedy, and Bobby Kennedy came. And Bobby Kennedy asked me to invite all the great thinkers. He gave me a list of the time who were at Oxford. people like Sir Isaiah Berlin and Sir Kenneth Weir and Sir Maurice Barrow. And so I found myself at the age of 22 sitting with Bobby Kennedy and all these luminaries discussing what the U.S. should do in Vietnam. And I well remember saying to Bobby Kennedy in answer to the question, what would you do? I said, I would withdraw from Vietnam. And he said, but look at the consequences if we withdraw. I said, but the end is going to be that you withdraw, so better to do it sooner rather than later. Now, I gave this anecdote because I had by then begun to get confidence in my judgment.
For sure.
And so so I was brought up to be very ambitious, and I wanted to build something of real significance, and I felt again that I could achieve anything that I set my mind to. Now I think this is what characterizes entrepreneurs. Ventures grow to the size of their entrepreneur's vision. An entrepreneur with a small vision will build a small company. You very seldom find an entrepreneur starting out with a small vision and ending up with a massive company. It tends to be that if you think big, you achieve big. And in my first book, The Second Bounce of the Ball, I deal with this question of climbing the north face and getting to the top, picking a really big challenge and achieving it. Now, part of it is my background at home. A Jewish mother is a great incentive in life because you wake up every morning being told you're the best and the most handsome and the cleverest, and you should go for it. But a lot of it had to do with my time at Oxford, actually. And then when I was about to graduate with my degree in philosophy, politics, and economics. After my term as president of the union, just ahead of my final exam, I went home and asked my dad, I said, what am I going to do now with a degree in PPE? He said to me, why don't you go to Harvard Business School? I'd never discussed Harvard Business School with him before, Jean-Philippe. And he gave me the opportunity to think about something that turned out to be just the right step for me. And I was lucky to get a scholarship, and I went to HBS. I discovered venture capital there, and the rest followed.
So a lot of more than encouragement, a lot of exciting challenges and aspiration driven by your parents, Ronnie, in your childhood, and of course as you grow up as well. We'll come back, obviously, to your vision of finance and evolving vision of finance you have. We talk a lot about being purpose-led in the podcast, and in terms of what you want to do with your life. And I mean with your life, your entire life, right? Both your personal and your professional life together. And the way you want to connect that with whatever you get to do. In your early 60s, you started bringing your purpose to life in a new way, when you decided to dedicate your time to transforming finance into an engine for positive impact. So what led you to make that mental shift, to move beyond the fundamentals of risk and return venture capital to embrace impact investment made with intention to generate measurable social and environmental impact alongside a financial return? Tell us, what has been the trigger and why?
So in retrospect, the dots connect in all our lives, Jean-Philippe. But looking ahead, they don't connect as obviously as reality eventually shows them to do. So I decided at the age of 53 that I would leave Apax at 60, and that every partner after me at Apax would leave at the same age. I would leave my shares to my partners, and the aim would be to build a powerful legacy institution. Today, Apax has gone through 2 leadership transitions and manages $75 billion in private equity. So I had the ambition to leave a firm that continues to thrive. In fact, this year is the 50th anniversary of my setting out, and we're celebrating it. So I knew that I didn't want my epitaph to read, "He delivered a 30% rate of return." Right? It didn't seem like the meaning of my life.
Yeah.
And I was very focused on social issues. I'd gone into venture capital because I thought it was a way of doing good and doing well. It was a way of making money, certainly, but it was a way of creating jobs as well, and improving the opportunities that people from very simple backgrounds would have to acquire wealth. But as time went on, I realized that I was actually helping to increase the gap between rich and poor. And so I decided to leave Apax to devote my life to two issues, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict resolution, which we touched on, and social issues. And then luck came into it. Because while I was in that process, in 2000, so when I was 55, I got a phone call from the British Treasury saying, "Will you look with a more entrepreneurial eye at how we deal with the issue of poverty? However much money we seem to throw at it, we don't seem to make a big dent in it." And that gave me the opportunity to delve deeply into the reasons why we hadn't dealt with poverty more effectively. And because of my background in venture capital, I realized that we had not given investment to those who want to improve lives. And in 2000, the Social Investment Task Force, which I led, published a report saying basically we need to innovate in ways of bringing investment to those who want to improve lives, people in the social sector, more than the world of business. Now, that effort then, through a number of milestones, led to the discovery, 10 years later, at Social Finance, which I co-founded in 2007, of the first social impact bond.
Yeah, can you tell us... Sorry, Ronnie, can you tell us more about that concept? Because I recall, of course, reading your book that you decided to really focus on a very specific issue in the UK, the reoffending rate of short-term male prisoners released from Peterborough jail in the UK. And I think it was a success. You brought down the reoffending rate by 9%, and you paid out a dividend of 3% to investors. So how does it work? Because it's a very new model for investors.
So Social Finance was 3 years old, and I had a team of 18 people working in the basement of my office in Portland Place. And 2 young people, 30-year-olds, came up to my office one day and said, "You know, we've been trying to work out how to innovate in reducing the rate, as you were saying, of at which prisoners go back to jail, which is over 60% across the world. What do you think," they asked, "if we link a reduction in the number going back to jail to a financial return?" I said to them, "You found the key to the capital markets for social entrepreneurs. We've all assumed that we can't measure anything in the social area, but we can measure a percentage reduction.
Absolutely.
May not be a measurement of the quality of life of a prisoner, but we can measure a percentage reduction." And we went to the Minister of Justice, whom I happen to know, and we said, "Look, we will raise £5 million. We wanted to raise 12, interestingly, but because of the obligation to pay on the results and budgets and government budgets, we ended up with £5 million and 1 jail instead of 3, which I had wanted." And famously, Jack Straw, the Justice Minister, after he'd heard our pitch, said to his colleagues, I know we shouldn't do anything for the first time, but we're going to do this. Okay.
He was brave enough. Yeah.
He was brave enough to do it. So the idea is, if you promise to pay, you, the government, or a group of philanthropists or aid organizations, or a combination of all three, promise to pay for social improvement achieved, then that promise to pay, that contract, enables you to raise money from investors who then take the delivery risk on. It means that the government doesn't have to put the money up, but very importantly, like venture capital, it gives fantastic focus to the leader of the organization trying to reduce the recidivism rate. It leads to the generation of great data so that you can do a better job at doing it. It means you're managing the process and improving the process of rehabilitating these prisoners. So, whereas previously there were some organizations working with the prisoner in the prison, some working with the prisoner at the gate, some working with the prisoner trying to get into a job, some working with the prisoner trying to reconnect with their families and society. All of a sudden, you had one focus: to get the prisoner to avoid going back to jail, to get into a job. And all of a sudden, the system changes. And in fact, the results coming from social impact bonds are 10 times the amount expended in terms of economic
return
value, socio-economic value. 10 times. We sit across several countries. That's how it works.
No, that's a super exciting story and very specific example, because sometimes people talk about social innovation. They talk about, of course, social impact measurement that you know well. There's a lot of books on that. But I think having created a real-world system as well, both for social entrepreneurs, but also for the society and the investors to actually give back, but in a responsible way, in a way that matters and that scale financially, makes a lot of sense. Just building on that, of course, because we picked and you picked that issue, but there are so many other issues, of course, not just in UK, in the world to go after. I was speaking a few months back, Ronnie, to a social entrepreneur and philanthropist, Akhtar Bacha, who's a friend of mine, on podcast. And he said something that really struck with me. He said, don't try just to build organizations, build a movement. A movement. And as I love meeting with a lot of social entrepreneurs in my life as well, I'm supporting a community of entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs in my home country in France, as I share with you. I'm certainly very, very sensitive to that kind of movement concept. So is this something that you've been consciously trying to achieve from the very beginning in a way? So beyond the prisoner reinfunding rate, what is the movement you were to create and sustain, and you aspire to see even bigger now, Ronnie?
That's a great question, Jean-Philippe. The answer is yes. We were trying to create a movement. But the ideology of the movement, the ideas supporting it, evolved. And again, it's a question of luck. In 2012, because of the success of Bridges Ventures, which was the first impact venture capital firm, which I co-founded in 2002, because of the success of social finance, because of the success of social impact bonds, the Cameron government asked me to chair a G8 task force on social impact investment. And this was a seminal effort, and the report we wrote is a seminal report, and interestingly, it's titled The Invisible Heart of Markets, as opposed to Adam Smith's Invisible Hand of Markets. What we saw was that what the social impact was doing, which was we could then express as optimizing risk, return, and impact, was happening in the world. You could look at 13 trillion of environmental, social, and governance money. Today it's over 40 trillions, 9 years later. You could define a field of impact investment where you have the intention to create impact, but you also measure the impact created. And so the notion then shifted from saying we've invented a new instrument that can help charitable organizations or businesses seeking to achieve social or environmental improvement to fund themselves in very imaginative ways. And by the way, the idea has caught on in financial markets now, and there's $1.5 trillion, not billion, trillion dollars, Jean-Philippe, of sustainability-linked bonds and loans inspired by the social impact bond. But that idea of pay for success was only part of the story. The question then arose, if the world is moving to risk, return, and impact, which is the way to tackle our social and environmental issues, what's required for this shift of system? And the answer was simple, impact measurement. And so the idea shifted from funding the non-profit sector and businesses trying to do good to changing our economic system and moving to impact economies. And we're well on our way to achieving them now.
I'd like to go back to that, actually, Ronnie. It's a great development, obviously, of history, of capitalism as well. I think you would agree about the fact that capitalism is confronting an unprecedented identity crisis. When you look at where we stand against the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, we are falling behind. Inequality is increasing. Climate change is obviously burning, literally. But it's also a fact that capitalism, and I'm certainly part of the corporate world, so I can relate to that, has proven to be the most formidable engine of prosperity, enabling our societies to levels of development that we could not even conceive 2 centuries ago. So given all the involvement you had, as you said, at the core of government, of the G8 and more, how do you see the role of government bring about the change? And let's start with that question.
Okay. So there are several questions in the question you ask. The first is, what is driving capitalism today? And the answer is there's a very big change in what's driving capitalism. There's a huge change in values, which started 10 or 15 years ago with young people who refused to buy the products of firms that were creating harm, or to work for those firms. And that became noticed by investors, and they realized that it had implications for the profitability of their companies. And then asset managers were also under pressure from their clients. Pension funds were under pressure from their savers to do the right thing with regard to the environment and society. And now, as we were saying, you're talking of tens of trillions. You're like half of all professionally managed money is following ESG guidelines, seeking to achieve impact as well as profit. Now, that's a big change in terms of capitalism. The second thing is we're seeing a second leap in technology that is as significant as the invention of the microchip has been. The invention of the microchip at the time was thought by a lot of people to threaten the computer industry with change. But now we see that retailing is completely transformed by it. Every single business model in the world has been transformed by technology over the last 40 years. The same is happening again, but this time the technology is coming together with the values I just described to deliver impact at the same time. And Tesla is a good example of it, because Tesla didn't go out to just optimize risk and return. It went out to optimize risk, return, and impact. I may not have done so perfectly, because we don't measure all its impact, maybe it's a net harm full company rather than a positive company bringing solutions. But you have to recognize that a key to its success was the impact dimension. Consumers who wanted to buy their products, talent who wanted to work for them, investors who wanted to invest in companies that were doing good, doing well. And 156 million of venture capital in 2000 has turned into a trillion. And the third force, which is a major, major change that goes with the change in values and the leaps in technology, is that the technology enables us to measure the impacts of companies in ways we have never been able to do. In the last half a dozen years, big data and computing and machine learning and artificial intelligence have enabled us to calculate the monetary value of the impacts that companies create from their operations on the environment, from their products on people and the environment, from their supply chains on people and the environment, and from their employment on people. And so the effort at Impact Weighted Accounts Initiative at Harvard Business School, which I'm privileged to chair, has published data sets of more than 15,000 companies today, showing some of their impacts in monetary terms. And if you look at what's happening in the world, and I don't want to anticipate your future questions, but I may as well make the point while I'm on it. You see the SEC putting on the table now mandatory disclosure of every environmental impact that's material by companies. You see IFRSF, the foundation responsible for financial accounting across the world, setting up the International Sustainability Standards Board under the brilliant leadership of Emmanuel Faber, the former CEO of Danone. You see the EU passing legislation on transparency of investment vehicles, which affects every asset management organization that wants to sell in the EU. So we're now in the transition to impact economies that optimize risk, return, and impact.
So we see all of that happening, Ronnie. I'm with you. There's a lot of momentum again. And as you said, I mean, it's pretty mind-blowing. I think Bloomberg said the ESG assets could exceed $50 trillion by 2025, one-third of the total projected assets in the world under management globally. It's just huge. So those numbers, as you said, reflect acutely the awareness, and more than awareness, the drive to take some actions among investors, shareholders, etc. But the problem, as you rightly said, is measurement. It's something we'll talk a lot about at Microsoft as well, and we're trying to help with our data, digital, cloud platform capabilities. So my question is really, how can we pick, and measure impact funds that can really make a difference? Given your depths of experience, that's a question first. As a pure investor, how would you do that? And then we can go beyond that to talk about the standards that are not necessarily all there underlying those data.
Right.
Yeah.
So for an investor to be able to measure their impact, they have to be able to measure the impact of the companies they invest in.
Yeah.
We've shown at the Impact Weighted Accounts Initiative at Harvard Business School that you can create frameworks, which we have published. We've published more than 23 reports over the last 3 years that show how you measure the different categories of impact. You can measure environmental impact. You can see that ExxonMobil creates $39 billion of pollution from its operations a year. You can compare it with Shell at 23 and with BP at 13. And you can see within the fossil fuel areas that some companies are better performers from point of view of impact, and others are laggards. And the money is going to the better performers. We see already a correlation, not necessarily in the fossil fuel industry, I don't remember, but across many sectors, you see a correlation between higher pollution and lower stock market valuation. You can do the same for employment, Jean-Philippe.
Yes.
I think this is a mind-blowing step forward.
sure.
You can look at the issue of diversity in a company's employment.
Yep.
You can compare the demographics inside and outside its facilities. You can put an average salary on the missing numbers of people from gender groups or ethnic groups. You can measure advancement and you can measure differences in pay. And you can come to the conclusion that Amazon has a $6.5 billion diversity debit a year versus Apple of 2.5. And if you relate it to wage bill, Amazon's actually the better performer with 16% of the wage bill in diversity debit versus Apple's 24%. And you can do the same with product impact. You can measure the sugar content harm that is created by Danone and say it's $8 billion a year against EBITDA of $5 billion a year. You can look at General Mills fiber and say the net health impact is plus $2 billion. And you can see apps in France, by the way, like Yaka, used by more than 20 million people to...
Yeah, Ronnie, I'm with you. And obviously, there's already tons of work happening through Harvard, many institutions as well. But the key to me is how do you establish global standards? How do you create that accounting integrity when it comes to ESG? And you know that super well because you've been so close of the GAP system emerging in the older days. What is the new GAP system that globally could become relevant for all business so that there's one version of the truth that can be really analyzed the same way? Are we going to get there, you think? What is needed to go there?
We're definitely getting there, and we're going to get there within the next 3 to 5 years. Why? Because the data around impacts is stock price sensitive, as we've been saying. And the more data abounds, the less verified data, the less comparable data there is, the bigger the problem for regulators who want to maintain orderly markets. That's why you see standardization coming in now through the SEC and the ISSB. Now, it's coming on quantity metrics, tons of carbon, liters of water, but the effort of the IWAI at Harvard and now the new International Foundation for Valuing Impact will be to standardize the valuation coefficients to go with these metrics. And then you will have generally accepted impact principles. Now, if we have a minute, Jean-Philippe, I just want to say humanity has already been there. After the crash of 29, investors sat up and realized they had been investing in companies without understanding what profits they made. Every company could pick its own accounting policies, and there were no auditors to verify the numbers. It took 4 years to get to the mandatory use of GAAP accounting and the use of auditors. 2 years after COVID-19, we already have efforts to standardize the impact metrics of quantities. And we are advancing on the valuation front. So what's happening is that we have found a way now to bring impacts into financial analysis and the valuation of companies. And it's going to have to become mandatory because that information needs to be made available to every investor. And that's the role of regulators.
Well, I'm glad to hear, Ronnie, that you are optimistic about that urgency to happen in terms of standards, measurement, accounting, because I think it's going to be foundational to making that investment thesis you have real across the world and get the corporate world to certainly take his part to the challenges. Now, I'd like to finish a couple of questions and shift gears a little bit, Ronnie, to talk about leadership. And, in your case, you've been an entrepreneur, you've been an investor, a CEO, a chairman, government advisor, philanthropist, author, and many other things. So in all those capacities, you've been able to make an impact by bringing the best of finance to serve the social good in the world. As you reflect on your unique strengths and talents, what would be your advice to a young person, not necessarily a refugee, but let's say just a young person, a young female, male, on how to be the change they want to see in the world? What should they do?
They should bring impact to their core values. If you want to work for a company that's delivering positive impact. If you want to be an entrepreneur, create a business model that has impact at its core. The more sales and profits you create, the more impact you deliver. If you want to work for a non-profit organization, measure the outcomes that you create. Use these new tools of impact investment to supplement traditional grant giving. And if you want to be an investor, then realize that optimizing risk, return, and impact is the best way to deliver superior returns today. Superior returns. That's the new game. How to use impact to drive superior returns and get your portfolio to align with the creation of impact. You don't need to invest in companies that do harm. In fact, today, you see very few ventures being created that have as their aim to make a ton of money while polluting the atmosphere. Values have changed. And if you want to work for government, then get yourself into the impact unit of the government. Here in France, where you're based and from which I happen to be speaking today, there's an impact unit in the Ministry of Finance with 8 people in it. Get yourself into that unit and drive this revolution forward.
Well, thanks so much for your coaching for many of our listeners, Ronnie, and for youth in the world in the way they can actually drive impact in their lives. As we said all along this podcast, I think you remain an incredible optimist. You refer to this forum, I think, where you talked the future of capitalism that you had in the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business, where you said there are 3 major forces around acting in the world to improve it today: environmental and social values, technology innovation, and impact measurement. So I believe, like you does, that those 3 forces can be for good, actually, if they are well combined together. But it seems to me that we also need something else. We need a new leadership model, a new leadership mindset. We need leaders who are purpose-led, who can drive positive energy in everything they do, and who are striving to change the world for good. So what will it take to bring about this new generation of what I'm calling positive leaders who can nurture the common good? What do we need and how it's going to happen?
So we asked the same questions when technology came, right, Jean-Philippe?
Yeah.
How are we going to get a new generation of managers who understand technology? The answer is entrepreneurship and a huge venture capital and private equity sector now, $10 trillion worth. When I started out, my first fund in Europe, 1981, 10 million pounds.
Wow.
Latest Apex fund, 14 or 15 billion, right? The venture capital industry is a very powerful engine. $25 billion went into venture investing last year related to climate alone. Right. So this combination of entrepreneurship and available capital is what is going to drive this disruption. And those that don't embrace impact thinking are going to be left behind, like IBM was left behind by Microsoft and Apple and others. So this is a mega trend. And if you're young today, in the same way that I felt something was in the air when I was 26, and that technology and entrepreneurship was going to be a huge thing globally. It wasn't just going to be in the United States, as some people thought it might be. Then similarly today, sense what's in the air today. Sense that we cannot solve our social and environmental problems without a change in our system. It's our system, stupid. It's our economic system, stupid, right? And to change our economic system, we have to drive capitalism to optimize not just risk and return, but risk, return, and impact. And we have to get companies to bring solutions, not to create problems. So, as a young person today, you're the ones, or as a young person, you are the one who is going to be leading this revolution.
That's a wonderful way to almost conclude. But before concluding this conversation, Ronnie, I'd like to finish with a note of spirituality. One of my favorite books is The Second Mountain by David Brooks. Don't know if you've read it. Maybe not, but it'd be a pleasure to offer you a copy if that's of interest. So just to share his vision for our listeners, the first mountain, he said, is the individualist worldview, which puts the desires of the ego at the center. The second mountain is what you might call the relationalist worldview, which puts relationship commitment and the desires of the heart and soul at the center. Eventually, most people realize that the central joy of modern life is to move from being all about me to being at the service of others. So David Brooks calls it the good life, and he wrote, relational life is a challenging life, but ultimately it is a joyful life because it is enmeshed in affection and crowned with moral joy. So, Ronnie, you're obviously well on your way to the top of your second mountain. Have you reached what David Brooks called moral joy, and do you feel that deep sense of joy inside yourself every single day of your life?
I'm a great admirer of David Brooks, and I read his articles. I would love to read his book. I have said something similar in my books. I have said fulfillment comes from a balance between what you do for yourself and what you do for others. And I find fulfillment in the last 20 years, which has been 80% to improving the lives of others and the environment and trying to resolve the Israeli or help resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I have found more fulfillment in that than in anything else in my career. And it isn't our duty to solve everything. It's our duty to start the process of solving everything. And so I totally agree with David Brooks, and I think the millennial generation is on his wavelength.
Fantastic, Sir Ronald Cohen. Again, it was really a delight to have this conversation with you and to feel not only this invisible heart of capitalism, but actually to feel a vibrant heart of new capitalism and new leadership as well. So thank you so much for being part of that podcast. It was really a privilege. Thank you so much, Ronnie.
Thank you very much, Jean-Philippe. Thank you for all you do.